Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of My JavaScript Story. This week, we're talking to Anatoliy or Toli
Zaslavskiy.
Zaslavskiy. Oh, I feel better now. Okay, there we go. This episode is sponsored by Sentry.io. Recently, I came across a great tool for tracking and monitoring problems in my apps. Then I asked them if they wanted to sponsor the show and allow me to share my experience with you. Sentry provides a terrific interface for keeping track of what's going on with my app. It also tracks releases so I can tell if what I deployed makes things better or worse. They give full stack traces and as much information as possible about the situation when the error occurred to help you track down the errors. Plus, one thing I love, you can customize the context provided by Sentry. So, if you're looking for specific information about the request, you can provide it. It automatically scrubs passwords and secure information, and you can customize the scrubbing as well. Finally, it has a user feedback system built in that you can use to get information from your users. Oh, and I also love that they support open source to the point where they actually open sourced Sentry if you want to self-host it. Use the code devchat at Sentry.io to get 2 months free on Sentry's small plan. That's code devchat at Sentry.io. You are on episode 358 of JavaScript Jabber. We talked about Pickle.js, tooling, and developer happiness.
Yep.
What else should people know about you?
I guess I work for a really cool company called Hover. We make 3D visualizations of houses. And what I'm starting to do at Hover is kind of the front-end infrastructure. So building all the common components, reference architectures, trying out technologies. That's what I do.
Very cool. Yeah, it sounds like a really cool job because you get to do all the visualization stuff and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
This show is about your story and just talking about how you got into coding and how you got to where you are now. And I'm really curious just to jump in and talk about it. How did you get into programming?
I guess it really depends on what you define as programming. I was into computers since I was 7 years old. And then I did a lot of, little scripting here and there.
Mm-hmm.
I remember it was probably middle school, but I started programming on my TI-83, if you can call that programming. Then I got into Visual Basic, and I was really into the show Avatar: The Last Airbender. And
great show.
Yeah. But there was a whole online community about it. And then there was this kind of rift in the community, and I ended up sort of creating an alternative one on MediaWiki and PHPBB. And then I was like, well, I want to learn how I could, make more customizations to it. So I started learning more PHP, and I guess that's when I would say I officially started really programming.
Nice. That reminds me of the stories I get where it was, well, I was building a website for my band.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
And then it turns into, and then I just kept doing it because I liked it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yep. Except your version is nerdier. So.
Yeah. Also, in high school, we had this really well-funded yearbook department. I think we received something like $250,000 a year. So we got coolest equipment, Nikon D3s, $6,000 printers. And one day I said, hey, can we buy a server and just have a custom process for all the photos, for all the articles. So I set up MediaWiki. I set up, Coppermine Picture Gallery, I think it was.
Okay.
And then I basically just edited it and made extensions to it to really make our whole editorial process much easier. Then I started writing little PHP scripts to handle all the other stuff that the yearbook department did. Had this, we were in charge of the prom and other events. So I made this really cool app where you would just swipe your student ID and you would be able to choose your table where you sit. And you see all your friends. And it was just really great because I could do all these things with so little code, and it was just all logic. And I loved PHP back then. I remember discovering XML requests, whatever Ajax was called back then. And back then, I would just call to get a PHP HTML page, and then I would replace whatever I needed with that HTML page instead of getting JSON.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Yeah, I remember doing that and then doing like inner HTML updates with jQuery and things like that.
Yeah, exactly. I was really happy when jQuery came along because it made everything so much easier.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. It was like, whoa.
My stuff's not broken anymore.
Yep.
Yep. So, yeah, so you get into doing all of this web development stuff with PHP. Did you go on to get like a computer science degree, or did you move up through the ranks just kind of working through things, or how did you move ahead from there?
So after high school, I went to NYU, and I was studying computer science there, but it was not what I expected because I learned like all of these practical applications of what I could do with PHP in the real world. And here I was like learning about binary trees and big O notation. I was like, when would I ever use that? Well, it turns out that 9 years later, finally I do have a use for it since I'm getting like more into computational geometry and stuff. But for 8 years, I did not use anything that I learned that 1 year in college.
Nice. So yeah, it's funny because I have a brother that's going through a computer science program right now, and yeah, he's like, so what should I be learning that's going to help me most of my career? And I said, learn to work with other people.
Yep.
Right. And he's like, well, what about all this stuff? I'm learning all these algorithms and things, and I'm like, yeah, those are all nice to haves.
Yeah, pretty much. I think like it's useful for getting the job, like if you're applying to Google or something, but you could just like go on one of those sites which gives you example problems, and I think it's like $30 a month. One of my roommates was using it just a few months and you're set.
Yeah, I have one of those that I like. It's called Interview Cake, and yeah, you just go in and work through all the little courses on each one, and yeah, you get through it pretty fast, and you come out of it understanding Big O and all of that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
All that stuff that I've forgotten since I got my computer engineering degree.
Yep.
Yeah. It's been a little longer than 9 years though for me. But anyway, I am curious then. So you finish your degree in computer science? How did you wind up? You didn't?
No, I just did 1 year at NYU, and then I got this offer from what was it called? MDA, which was a medical company.
Okay.
I was basically building their WordPress site. And I was like, well, this is about what I would be making if I finished NYU, so might as well just get on with it now.
Yep, fair enough.
Mm-hmm.
So how did you get into doing JavaScript then?
Well, let's see. I was doing PHP for a few years. And then I got a call from a recruiter, and they said, like, hey, do you want to work for the Wall Street Journal? And I was like, whoa, that sounds like a fun opportunity. What would I be doing there? I know some PHP. And they're like, well, we need help with data visualization. Do you know any of that? I didn't, but they said, fine, good enough. You're hired.
You know how to do what we want? Nope. Good, you're hired.
Yeah. And anyways, it actually worked out quite well because everyone in the department was a really good reporter, but not a really good programmer. And, they were doing data visualization, but basically they were doing it as if they were more artists, designers, reporters, not so much like from the logic organization side. So I kind of came in there and I started learning all these technologies like D3, Backbone, Node, and I basically just started really organizing how Wall Street Journal did their data visualizations. And I really, really liked it. It was so much better than doing this PHP work because I could see instant results. And Yeah. So eventually I got a call from a recruiter who got me into the Federal Reserve of New York. And they were basically poaching people from the Wall Street Journal, New York Times.
Mm-hmm.
And I got to basically work on data visualization for them for a while.
Right.
And I was part of this bigger group, which was called the Common Components group. And basically they were building sort of the common architecture for all the front-end applications. Basically everyone was just kind of used to writing everything in Java and pretty much just Java. And they were like, let's bring in a few startup people to like really spice things up. So back then we were using Backbone.js, and I had, some free cycles, and they said, hey, do you want to make some components in Backbone.js? So I wrote like this entire framework for doing reporting applications. It was actually a really cool framework. I think it got used on a few different applications. And yeah, it was really great at dealing with just these enormous API libraries where you just had various data sets and you needed to query them in various ways, display them in a table, sort through them, edit them. That's how I got into front end.
Nice. So yeah, you've been doing front end, but it sounds like you're doing things that are a little bit different from what most people do on the front end.
Yeah. I mean, what I always enjoyed was more of the infrastructural work. I was working at a few companies as more of a product engineer, but it was never quite appealing to just like build features.
Mm-hmm.
And basically what happened at my current job, I was hired to work on some features, and I was kind of miserable. And I guess one thing I should probably say about my story, I have bipolar disorder.
Okay.
And this was actually a turning point in my life. Bipolar disorder, basically it has two phases. It has a manic phase and a depressive phase. And during the depressive phase, what would happen to me is I would just get extremely demotivated. I would basically just do the minimal possible work. And a lot of times I would just quit my job and just do nothing for a few months, just be locked up in my room. And during the manic phases, it would start out great. I would be really great at my job. I'd be producing like all this work. Everyone's like, whoa, like here's a whole bunch of new responsibilities. But every time I would eventually run out of energy and just have a crash. And suddenly I'm in charge of all these different things. And, I have zero energy to work on them. So for a while, that was really messing with the progression of my career. But however, it was the first time that I told my boss that, hey, I have bipolar disorder.
Mm-hmm.
The way that it happened, I actually ended up taking a 2-month medical leave. And when I came back, I had to say something, I guess.
Right.
And, I thought I would get fired or, not really receive much support. But actually the company was extremely, extremely supportive. And we kind of walked through all of my triggers, all of the things that help me, all the things that distract me. And they put me in a position which turned out to be really great, both for myself and for the company. We basically figured out that I'm not really that great at feature work. It's something that very quickly demotivates me and depresses me. But I really enjoy working on this more infrastructural architectural work. So they started throwing me all these projects, like Pickle.js. I did an episode on that, was one of them, which is basically making software for engineers.
Right.
And it just really changed my career. It turned everything around.
That's awesome. And it's interesting too, because it seems like some companies, they just don't really get it, right? It's, you've got this engineer and they are this resource that they're supposed to be producing X, Y, and Z. And if they're not producing X, Y, and Z, then we got to get rid of them and find somebody else. And in reality, it's like, hey, let's sit down. Let's figure out, okay, what are we dealing with here? How do we make this work for both of us? And then you get this person that's actually driven to do what you need done.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And on the other side, that they're happy working with you. You're happy working with them. I mean, it's a win-win all around. And a lot of these companies, they're just looking for a pair of hands that will, essentially crank out code, and it just doesn't work that way.
Exactly. Yeah.
I think your case is an extreme case, but I think this is true of just about everybody. You've got to find that thing that clicks with people.
Absolutely agree with that. It's actually something that we're trying to do a bit more in the organization. One of my coworkers suggested a rotational program where you would work on different teams and in different chapters. So say, for example, I'm a front-end engineer. Mm-hmm. Perhaps I would want to spend a few weeks learning Ruby and get some back-end skills.
Right.
I think it takes quite a while. Like it took me 8 or 9 years to really figure out what it is that I'm good at and where I thrive. But it doesn't have to take that long if a rotational program is in place.
Yeah, that makes sense too. And for the most part, I mean, I remember my first full-time job as a programmer, well, after working for the consultancy, which was, they essentially just hired me out. My first job was at a consultancy. And then after that, I went and I worked for an education lead gen company, right? And, the back end was Ruby and the front end was JavaScript. And, we did all kinds of stuff. This was back in the jQuery days, right? Backbone was kind of a thing that we started adopting before I left. Mm-hmm. But what turned out to be the real hang up and the thing that I spent a ton of time spinning my wheels on was figuring out how lead gen works, right? It wasn't Ruby. It wasn't how their application was architected because we were building a greenfield project. It was quite literally, how the heck is all of this work in the industry so that we can best take care of it? And it's the same thing everywhere else, right? So people complain too that, well, I can't hold on to people or, whatever. And it turns out that, well, they weren't really happy where they were, but you had another spot you could put them, right? And cross-train them. And then they still hold on to all that institutional knowledge that pays off for you.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I definitely think that I bring a lot more value doing something I like versus something I don't like. Maybe it's partly due to my condition, but definitely I've seen other engineers who don't have conditions and certainly perform better when they're interested. Yeah.
Oh, I do, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And it's actually, I think it's a human nature thing, but a lot of people call it the entrepreneur's dilemma, right? You work on something for a while and then you get bored and you go looking for something else to work on and you neglect all the things that are important.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's very human, right? It's like, oh, well, I'm not interested in this anymore. I've kind of mastered it. So I want to move on to something else. But the thing that you've mastered is the thing you got to keep working at.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very true. My friend actually has this theory that there are 3 basic types of development. There's sort of this R&D where you try things out and see what works. And an example of that is sort of what I'm doing right now, where I'm seeing like, hey, is Apollo the right solution for our company? Is X state something that we want to use?
Right.
Yeah. And then there's sort of the second kind, which is building the infrastructure, which I'm kind of doing as well. And that is more, okay, we've decided we want to use Apollo. Now, how do we architect a framework which everyone else can use?
Right.
Yeah. And then the third type is more feature development. And that is, all right, we have our infrastructure in place and we know how we're going to do things. Now let's actually go ahead and do them. And the thing is, there are people in our company who are very good at one or more of those things. Like I have this coworker, Brett. He's amazing at the third type, which is feature development. He's super organized. He's super on task. He's really great at breaking things down, seeing like what a user wants, and then building on top of the existing infrastructure. And then you have people like me who just like to play around with things.
Yep. So I guess, I mean, the reason that I'm doing this is because I want to give people the opportunity to hear somebody's story and go, hey, they're kind of like me. And I really identify with what they've gone through. And, you know, my interjections have mostly been pointed at the employer saying, don't be dumb. But if you're having some issues with your employment, some of it due to some potential mental health issues like depression or bipolar or, you know, something else, how do you recommend people go about dealing with it? I mean, is it generally safe to talk to your boss? Do you wish you had done that sooner? Or are there other better ways of figuring things out first? Or what do you recommend?
So during those 2 months, I was trying to figure out what I was going to do. Was I going to talk to my boss? Was I going to kind of just keep it vague? Was I just going to go ahead and find another job and, you know, get it over with? And I was pretty convinced that nobody would want to hire someone with bipolar, just because it seems like who would want to hire someone who's this unreliable and this up and down?
Right.
But then I talked to one of my friends who is one of the better engineers that I know. And he said, like, totally. In Silicon Valley, if you're a senior engineer, you can get away with just about anything. Like, you don't realize how valuable a senior engineer is in Silicon Valley.
Right.
And it's absolutely true. Like, maybe if I was in another profession, like a truck driver, I wouldn't have this amount of latitude, but I happen to be very lucky that I'm in this profession. And I think that people who are in the same boat, they should realize that as engineers, they have a lot more latitude than they think they do.
That's true. That's true generally everywhere too. I mean, a lot of people need developers. I have people coming to me all the time. How do I find a senior guy or a senior girl? And the reality is it's, you know, it's like, look, well, you got to know what you want. And then, you know, you got to go be where those people are and then hire them. But yeah, there's so much opportunity out there and you really can. And even if your situation is such to where you need a little bit more downtime or remote work or things like that, I mean, if you've got the skills, I mean, what they're looking for is they're looking for results. And so if you can give them the results they want, then it doesn't matter if, well, I deal better with my particular brand of mental illness. And we're all kind of, I don't want to say messed up, but we all have issues, right? And so I deal better with my issues, you know, be they something you can diagnose or something you cannot, by working at 4 a.m. They don't care. They want the results, right? And, you know, some of the results may be you got to interface with the team sometimes. But yeah, that's absolutely true. Yeah.
But there are definitely so many tweaks that an employer can make to your career to make things easier. For example, here are some tweaks that were made for my job. When I'm in a manic phase, I tend to get very, overactive in meetings, especially when I'm talking to clients, talking to product managers. I just start to come up with these crazy, you know, completely abstract ideas, which make me come off as a lunatic. So perhaps during those phases, I shouldn't be in meetings. This is something that definitely freaked people out in the past, but such a simple solution. Don't put me in meetings. Another thing is the type of work that I do, obviously. So I just happen to not find feature work very interesting. Well, that's fine. There's lots of different things in the company that are not feature work. I also have Asperger's. So I may not be the best communicator. And that's why they decided to pair me with other engineers. Another thing is I tend to not stay on task quite as well, as especially during my depressive phases because of the lack of motivation.
Right.
Well, basically for the last few months, I've been pair programming with other developers, and it's just been probably the best results of my life. Because I tend to be really great at executing specific tasks. If you ask me like, all right, this is the general architecture that we want to accomplish this purpose, I'm great at coding that out. But the problem is I easily go off on tangents where I would say like, I'm really interested in, I don't know, making the CSS library like the most perfect CSS library that it could possibly be. And then I would spend a month working on a CSS library while my job is to do that and 15 other tasks. So having this other engineer with me is great because they can say like, hey, this is good enough. Let's move forward and do something else.
That makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think a lot of it, a lot of it is defining, what a senior engineer is. And I've been at a lot of companies where people are like, wow, you're doing a great job. Why don't you become a team lead or become a team manager or, get some sort of responsibility? That's the general track. And the thing is, not everyone is cut out to be a manager, and not everyone is cut out to be a lead. And in my case, not everyone is even cut out to do things on their own and sort of be in charge of specific tasks. I used to have a lot of shame to admit those kinds of things because pretty much the definition of a senior engineer in the industry is someone who can take a task and run with it. But that's just not the kind of person that I am. I have great skills when it comes to that implementation side of it, but I do not have the skills when it comes to the organization side of things or the leadership side.
That makes sense too. And it's interesting because I think a lot of folks see the making you the team lead or whatever as not just a natural progression, but almost as a reward. And so, by moving you up, they may not be doing you a favor, even though they think they're doing you a favor. It's not just oh, well, you're the next guy in line, but it's, hey, we're going to do you a solid and move you up.
Exactly. I mean, that's just sort of how corporate America works. Like you get promoted to manager.
Yep. So are there things that you dealt with through your journey that I just wouldn't even think to ask about? Because I find that, for some things it's like, this is kind of a general human thing. And then for other things, like bipolar, I mean, I sort of, I've had a few friends that are bipolar, so I sort of academically understand what they go through, but I don't actually know what it's like. And I don't know what it's like to, have to work around it or work with it, depending on how you look at it during a career.
So probably another thing that I forgot to mention is the consistency factor. When you're working on features, a lot of times you have deadlines, and deadlines are very important. However, not everyone works well with deadlines. For some people, it really fuels them, kind of puts a fire under them to get things done. For other people, it just stresses them out. And I've been in so many situations where I started working on a project, I'm doing extremely well on it, and then I just run out of energy. not everyone has that level of consistency, especially with mental disorders. But there are so many projects which don't require that level of consistency and don't really have strict deadlines. For example, right now I'm working on common front-end architecture. If we have it, 1 or 2 months later than expected, it's not the end of the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, see, I'm one of those people where I get a deadline and I just get my motor going.
Right.
So,
and there are a lot of people like that.
Yep. And I think it's good also just to highlight the fact that everybody kind of works differently. They are motivated by different things. They get excited about different things, and you kind of need that in the organization as a whole.
Exactly. Yeah, I think in the future there will be a lot more studies on how individual people work. I think we're still running a lot like a factory type of organization, where everyone is just a machine and everyone does exactly the same thing. It's how our education system works. It's how our jobs work. It's how college works. Nothing is customized for individuals. But if you really want to get the most out of people, you don't treat them like a machine. You treat them as someone who has a very distinct configuration.
Yep. I agree. I think, though, also we have to keep in mind, because I'm with you in that I tend to say, you know what, the way that we do things is kind of antiquated and built on old ideas, right, with the factory idea and things like that. But that is also a very well understood set of conditions. And so I understand why people stick with them. The other thing is that technology has really come to the point where we can actually do that kind of customization, right? Or we can customize your space. We can customize how you work. We customize how you interact with people much more than we could 30 years ago. And so that's also a factor, right? And so a lot of people, they get super down on it. And really what it is it's just, hey, look, everybody needs to kind of sit down and, look up and see where things are heading and then think of a new way to do it. Not that the other way was necessarily wrong, but there's a better way now.
Exactly.
So do you have any things that you've built that you're particularly proud of that you think, oh, gee, this was a really cool project? It doesn't have to be famous. It doesn't have to be open source even, whatever. Could be, some little project you built when you were first learning, or it could be something you're working on now.
Sure. Let's think. Right now I'm actually working on a few interesting things. Probably the most useful one to front-end engineers would be our new styling system. So we use styled components, which is already pretty great, but we kind of implemented a system to have common colors, common margins, common sizes. A lot of times you have your designers hand you mock-ups and they have like, this size is 32 pixels, this size is 33 pixels, and there's just no consistency across different projects. So we just told our designers, like, hey, think of maybe 6 or 7 sizes that you want to work with, and call them extra small, small, large, etc.
Right.
And basically, we have a system where in our styled component, we just put color and the name of the color, the predefined color. It works with TypeScript, so you automatically get a little drop down of all your possible colors. Same thing for sizing, spacing, etc. And it just makes much cleaner code. So then on top of that, we sort of built this common box component where we just define very common things like, I want this box to have a margin top of extra small. I want it to have a background color of this, and you just add it as React properties. Hopefully we'll get to open source it once we're finished. But so far it's the simplest system that we found. We tried X-styled, which was pretty nice. but this is sort of a typed version of Xstyled.
Cool.
Yeah. So that's one thing. We've been playing around a lot with GraphQL Apollo. Definitely a great system for querying your backend. We've been doing a pilot of using Kubernetes.
Mm-hmm. How's that going?
It's still in its very early phases, but it seems extremely promising. The big problem we have in our organization is we have 4 DevOps people compared to 70 or so engineers. And for even the smallest things, like this morning we needed to add a CORS rule to our S3 bucket. It just takes an extremely long time because DevOps is backlogged, and understandably so. But with Kubernetes, we could basically just write our own little Helm file, and it kind of defines everything that we need, from the load balancers to the rules to the routing.
Right.
Just works. And the goal eventually is to have all of our front-end engineers be able to write a Kubernetes configuration and even write their own little kubeless functions, which is Kubernetes version of Lambdas, and make little prototypes of whatever they need. I think the point of DevOps is to enable programmers to do whatever they need, not to act as a barrier, and that's basically what Kubernetes aims to accomplish.
Nice. Yeah, I keep hearing good things about it. I've heard a lot of people say that it's not quite ready yet for that kind of a thing. I think it just depends on where you're at and what what you're capable of, what your background is, But yeah, really, really interesting stuff. And I think that's a direction that we're going to see more and more things go. We're actually starting. Well, we're relaunching or rebooting a DevOps show here within the next few weeks. So folks should keep an eye out for that. We'll be talking about a lot of that kind of thing as well.
That's awesome. I think you're absolutely right that there's sort of this conception of Kubernetes not really being fully baked for the general public. It's pretty hard to use. Those configuration files are pretty massive. There's a lot of boilerplate. And honestly, I think a lot of this configuration could be abstracted away. Mm-hmm. One of the projects that I hope to do is an abstraction on top of our Kubernetes framework, where we could just define very simple things, such as I need a storage system, I need I need a node server with 3x parallelization or custom scaling. I need a Nginx server which has these rules.
Right.
Essentially, just boil it down to the essentials of what you could possibly need. And I've seen a few different projects kind of attempt to do that, but nothing that's really user-friendly.
Yep. Well, and it's a problem we've been trying to solve for a long time, just with the general, I have a server, go set it up, go provision it. Mm-hmm. Or, go to the cloud and provision me a new one of these. It never quite got to the point where it was completely seamless.
Right. I actually really like Docker Compose. It's much simpler than Kubernetes. Mm-hmm. Obviously, you can't do most of the things you can do with Kubernetes with it. I've seen a library. Let me try to look it up. Kubernetes convert compose. It's called Compose with a K. Mm-hmm. And basically it takes your Docker Compose and kind of converts it into the Kubernetes YAMLs.
Right.
I think something along those lines is probably going to be what wins out.
Cool.
Yeah. Another thing is we've been having a lot of conversations about microservice architectures. So we have a lot of different services, and the problem is nobody really understands uh, like what all these are, what the interfaces are, what the schemas are. So there are a few efforts to try to solve some of these problems. GraphQL is certainly one of them, where you have this predefined schema, this predefined documentation of all of your endpoints. And also we want to use the Open API standard for REST calls. So that's one discussion that we've been having. Another interesting idea that one of my colleagues had is sort of a message broker. So I'm sure you're familiar with sort of the pub-sub architecture, like with SNS.
Yep.
So basically what this idea is designing a GUI where you can use the pub-sub architecture to have different services talk to each other dynamically. So say, for example, I have a image converter, which converts images from whatever size to 200 by 200. I know that it accepts JPEGs and it outputs, we call them normalized JPEGs. Well, theoretically speaking, they could be plugged into any part of the flow that needs a normalized image. And say, for example, there is a service that outputs a JPEG, and then another service which accepts a JPEG. We could just drop in that service in the middle. And the two services that output and accept a JPEG don't really need to know about each other. As long as the schemas kind of match, should be fine. Another thing that is very common problem in microservice architectures is schema mismatches. So one service talks to another one, but the API version is off, or it didn't actually follow a schema that it was supposed to. We want to put a little interceptor in every one of these pub-sub actions. It says like validate schema. If it doesn't validate, then either throw some error message to an error queue, or handle it, give it to an error handler that's predefined. So it's a lot of conversations like these that are happening of these are big problems to solve. There are a lot of possible solutions, but no one has really come up with a great generalized way to solve them.
Yep. Well, it'll be interesting to see where we end up with a lot of it.
For sure.
All right. Well, we're just about out of time. Can we just go over to picks, talk about stuff that you want to shout out about?
Sure. Let's see. So I've been playing around with this library called XState a lot. And basically it's a state machine, which can be used in your React application. And it's really great because, especially for complex applications, you have all these different states flying around and you forget to define what different combinations might look like and what transitions might look like. Here it sort of forces you to define every possible combination of states. Let's see. I had a list somewhere. There we go. Another thing that's pretty interesting is Watermelon DB. And it's something that works both with web apps and React Native apps. And it's kind of abstraction on, what is it called? Whatever the native database for the browser is. And it kind of allows you to do SQLite. And it allows you to do, common queries and caching, and it has this observer pattern, which I really like. And probably another thing that I would shout out to, it is not a library, but it's a common architecture style, which is starting to become popular, monorepo. So usually, you would put all of your code into different repositories, but we've been experimenting with putting everything in one repository. and using Lerna and other tools to help us manage that. And so far, it's been so much better. I think that's going to be the way to go in the future.
Nice. All right. Well, I'm going to jump in here, I guess, with a couple of picks. So this morning, I actually live streamed my first thing to Twitch. I've just kind of been playing with that, using a system called OBS, which I think is Open Broadcast System or Open Broadcast Software. Anyway, it's open source. It's free. And yeah, you just need your Twitch key from Twitch, and then you can stream. And so I just did I have people keep asking me how I plan out my days and weeks. And so I just did a quick Twitch stream. I had to cut it short because I had to jump off for a call, but I was just trying it out, and I'm really digging it. So yeah, I'm going to pick OBS and Twitch, and yeah, really, really excited about where that goes from here. And yeah, that's all I got. Toli, if people want to find you online, where do they go?
So best way, just go to my site, tolicodes.com, and there's contact info and all my profiles there. Yeah, would love to chat about anything infrastructure.
Nice. And that's Toli, Toli codes.
Yep.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you for coming.
Absolutely.
All right, folks, we're going to wrap this one up, and we'll come back at you next week with another story. Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CacheFly.com to learn more.